Everybody. Welcome to this session. I'm Rachel Bronson. I'm the president and CEO of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and I'm delighted to be with you today. I think I speak for all of our panelists when I say we wish we could have been with you in person. That was the intent, and we're sorry that that's not possible. Our panel today is Rethinking the World System of Collective Security 75 years after San Francisco, and few topics are more important, and I'm looking forward to a dynamic conversation today. Before I introduce our panelists, let me set the stage for everybody, and then we'll get into the conversation. I think it goes without saying that the 21st century presents daunting challenges. The description of the session that you've all seen lays out many of them: multiple and concurrent interstate conflicts, massive movements of refugees, huge investments being made in new advanced weaponry, including nuclear weapons. And I would add two more to the list. The first I would add is a rejection of multilateralism that we're seeing growing around the world, and a return to a parochialism and nativism, indeed a nationalism, that seems more familiar to the first half of the 20th century rather than the beginnings of the 21st century. And we're experiencing this return to nationalism at a time when the gravest threats we face are truly global. We're joining you from our home and in our homes around the world because of a pandemic that knows no boundaries. Climate change that we're experiencing and are ravaging the west coast of the United States right now, and in the beginning of the year, Australia does not respect borders. I'm sitting here in Chicago, thousands of miles away from the West Coast, and we see smoke from those fires here. And of course, the effects of nuclear warfare knows no boundaries. And even what some call a limited exchange will have global consequences environmentally, if not beyond. My organization, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, focuses on nuclear risk, climate change, and disruptive technologies, and we're not optimistic. Indeed, we're the setters of the doomsday clock, and as many of you may know, the doomsday clock is set at 100 seconds to midnight, the closest it's ever been in the nearly 75 years we've been setting it. We've done this largely because of a growing disregard for fact, science, and expertise that we see globally. We've set it here because of a walking away from international agreements, the Paris Climate Accords, the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, and also nuclear arms control treaties that offer transparency and confidence building measures. As an example, in February, this coming February, the last remaining US-Russian nuclear treaty, what's called New START, will expire unless it is extended. The US and Russia control 90% of the planet's nuclear weapons. For that agreement to disappear would be a tragedy. The NPT, the foundation of nuclear security, is 50 years old this year, and its future isn't looking particularly bright. In addition, new technologies are coming, and climate change is in front of us. So in short, to focus our attention on what our challenge is today, our architecture, our global architecture is straining. So where can we direct our efforts to make it more effective? Our institutions are aging. Where are the best examples and opportunities for innovation in the 21st century? And our challenges are truly global. So how can we continue to engineer our institutions to keep them fresh, modern, and robust? There is no panel better to answer these questions than the one we have before us today. So in terms of a very quick introduction, and I know many of you will be able to have at your fingertips a deeper one, we have with us President Juan Manuel Santos, a Nobel Peace Laureate and the former president of Colombia, President Danilo Turk, the former president of Slovenia and the president of the Club de Madrid, Dr. Lise Howard, a professor of international relations at Georgetown University and chair of the Academic Council on the United Nations System, and Ms. Gizem Klink, the leading coordinator of the United Network of Young Peace Builders. Later in the program, we'll also be joined by Ambassador Adela Raz, the permanent representative of Afghanistan to the United Nations. So let me begin with President Santos. President Santos, In recognition of your country's breakthrough in the peace process, you received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2016. Given your focus at the forum on the UN system, could you share with us one or two reflections on the UN's role, both in supporting your government and the people of Colombia in reaching their historic peace deal and in helping to solidify the gains to peace that the treaty represents?
Well, thank you, and good morning to all the participants. And the question you asked me, the answer is very simple. The peace process would not have been possible without the support of the UN. And the support came at different levels. First, when we started the peace process, there was no trust among the different parties. And the UN, in a way, facilitated and built the first bridges to create that necessary trust to solve the conflict. And that aspect is extremely important because you always need somebody to try to bring the parties together. And in this case, the UN did it. Secondly, the legitimacy of the process, the backing of the UN, the fact that the Security Council in a way adopted the peace process in Colombia. As a matter of fact, there's a very interesting statistic. There is no event in the history of the Security Council where more resolutions supporting that process, unanimous resolutions, have been adopted than the peace process in Colombia. And that gave us the strength and the legitimacy to continue and persevere, because building peace is many times more difficult than making war. The third aspect where I would like to highlight, and it was extremely important, is that it was the only body, or at least the body that was chosen to monitor and verify the procedures that were agreed, how the insurgency was going to lay off their arms, who would they give their arms to, what would happen to those arms, what would happen after, who would guarantee the security of the people who were reintegrated into society. In all that process, the UN participated very effectively, because it brought in also past experiences in other peace processes. So the UN was very, very determinant in the success of the peace process. And that's why I say that without the backing of the UN, this peace process would have been much, much more difficult.
Wonderful, thank you. I think laying it out, the power of the UN, its convening power, the legitimacy it brings, and the expertise it brings are key, are I hope, themes that we'll continue to come back to. Ambassador Raz, I see that you have joined us. Welcome. We're just getting started off. President Santos has just laid out for us some of the strengths that the UN brought that helped the Colombian peace process. And I'll come to you shortly. But President Turk, the last few years have been marked by some key withdrawals from international systems and institutions, as I discussed in my opening, as well as what some would call increasing skepticism about UN priorities such as human rights. Looking forward, how do you see these issues interacting with questions of peace and stability internationally? And how should the UN be thinking about this moving forward? Oh, you're muted. You're mute before you, thank you.
Well, thank you, Rachel. It's a pleasure to be part of this important discussion. And let me start by linking my answer to the analysis which was just offered by President Santos, because I think that there is a link there. See, I was Assistant Secretary General working with Kofi Annan in the first 5 years of this century. And at that time, obviously, the question of Colombia was not on the agenda of the Security Council. But the Secretary General, working with the then President of Colombia and with various actors, started to build a case for a role of the United Nations. The conditions were not proper at the beginning, and there were many difficulties, and it was necessary to stop the process at a certain point and re-establish it or refocus it later. So it went for years before even the Security Council even took it up at the level of its own decision-making. So what I'm trying to say is that one has to be very patient with the peacemaking function of the United Nations. The United Nations is a wonderful framework which creates norms, which creates principles, which creates policy orientations. But when it comes to specific peacemaking projects, then one has to understand the complexity, the depth of the problem, and of course have a lot of patience in dealing with the problems and helping to create the necessary confidence and subsequently using experience from various peace activities from the past. Now, how does that relate to the question of recent withdrawals? I would say, well, again, patience is really the most important quality one has to have in the United Nations. And I'm speaking this as a former staff member of the United Nations. One also has to take into account that the United Nations proper has not seen withdrawals in the formal sense, unlike the League of Nations in the first half of the 20th century. There was only one short-term withdrawal of Indonesia, but even that was not complete because the nameplate was left in the General Assembly Hall and then Indonesia came back. So one should not overestimate the issue of withdrawals. Although, of course, if we look at the situation today, we are all distressed by the fact that the United States withdrew from the Paris Climate Accord and announced the withdrawal from WHO. Those of us who remember the time of the US withdrawal from ILO or UNESCO are not entirely pessimistic because eventually the US came back. So again, patience is the key here. But then one final comment would be this. We should not abandon the path that the multilateral cooperation has traced from start. And I think 75th anniversary is a very good reminder for that. Irrespective of what happens, irrespective of the dramatic nature of challenges that we see, our path is only through multilateral cooperation as defined in 1945 and of course developed later. There is no shortage of good ideas. I have read the roadmap for the future we want and the UN we need, which is really a set of an excellent work and a set of ideas that come as a very good understanding and good knowledge and really creative thinking. Of course, one has to take into account the factor of power. Power is what is needed to move developments towards the objectives and ideas that are explained in that document. And here, obviously, one has to be patient. I'm sure with patience we'll find the right path forward. And in the meantime, I think the countries that continue to be committed to multilateral cooperation should exercise their commitment more actively. We have this alliance for multilateralism. It should be more visible and more active. China is declaring its continued commitment to multilateralism. So let us ask and see what China will contribute and so on. So I think that patience plus insistence is necessary. And just one last point, the question was raised as I was speaking by Richard Jordan about what are the skills that the diplomats at the UN would need most at this time. I would say, look, public relations, work with public opinion, because obviously the communication with powers, with states is there, and that can always be improved. But the main need here is really to work with world public opinion as effectively as possible. And here I see most tasks for the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Roz, are you with us? There you are. So
Yes,
welcome.
yes.
We're so
Thank
delighted to
you.
have you here today.
I am here. So I have my daughter going back and forth, so I didn't want to interrupt the conversation, but that's why I disconnected myself from the video, but I'm here.
Well, thank you. And if she does, then we'll all feel just fine when our children start running, going by. You'll set the trend. Well, I want to say, we've just heard from President Santos and President Turk, so I want to come to you next and talk about your experience, or Afghanistan's experience with the United Nations. In many ways, we're collecting some good news stories because there's so many challenges in front, but of course, Afghanistan has experienced its set of challenges with the UN as well. But I would love just for to get us started, how do you see the role of the United Nations in the Afghan context, and what are some of the lessons that you're taking away from its engagement in your country's experience?
Sure. Thank you, Rachel, for this opportunity to be sharing this honorable platform with high-level delegation and His Excellency Santos. I think your work in Colombia is something that His Excellency President Ghani always makes a reference to, and as well as President Turk. It's great to hear too. Well, it's an important question because first, UN had been an important partner for Afghanistan, and it was not only in last 20 years, but even before. With the complexity of the civil war that we had, UN engagement was something that had always created, to a certain level, the balance that was required. But specifically discussing the last 19 years, UN's work in the field of development and the field of the UN's political engagement and setting up our first draft of the constitution and later being ratified, those are very substantial and very constructive engagement that has been recorded in our history. And right now, the role of UN is also extremely important because we, as everyone knows, we just started our peace talks. And the first round of the intra-Afghan negotiations started in Doha. With the peace talks, UN's engagement is not too broad, but one area we think UN would be extremely effective, and we have had conversation with our UN colleagues, was the post-peace conversation when it comes to the development. In our experience, yes, UN engagement was positive, but there were certain areas that could have been strengthened, and what we have learned. One was the coordination role. UN, with the role that it had in Afghanistan, because it's a country, especially in the last 19 years, there had been an extensive support from our international partners, and that comes from the donor community as well. And about it to coordinate that, the funding and the relationship with the donor was extremely important, and UN did its work effectively. But at the same time, there is a large number of UN agencies working in the ground. So one area that the government of Afghanistan was in conversation with the UN was that within their itself, the agencies need to coordinate. And I think for some of us now working at HQ, and I'm sure for Mr. Turk, it's also an experience that he may relate to, that and Secretary General is also highlighting that the level of coordination that needs to exist, it unfortunately does not exist within UN agencies. So currently the regional coordinators, the residence coordinators could play an important role to create the coordination that needs to happen, but it's not at the level that it should be. So that's one perspective. The second is also, I think we have talked here at the UN, we are discussing, is that the tools and the mechanism that the UN has as of now for a country like Afghanistan, where we're still talking about conflict prevention. I think those tools are not, is not really, sufficient for today's 21st century conflict and dilemmas that we have. I think UN is so much set up to the rules and the procedures and with the tools that responds to the nature of conflict that existed 75 years ago. Or so it's not to today, because today we live in a complex world where the rise of terrorism is something true. And we don't have really direct parties that were engaged. I think state-sponsored terrorism is something that's arriving and it's happening. And I think UN is shying away and has still shied away to engage in that conversation. And the way I say, look, we have a different disease and the remedies and the prescription we have doesn't fit what the disease is. So I think that adjustment needs to take place, and it hasn't taken yet. And we all know for known reasons, I think, because there's the politics of this dilemma is so intense. For instance, at the UN, we still have not been able to define terrorism. There is not one definition. So it starts from that basic and until going to provide and prepare the right tools for conflict prevention. So those would be my very two right away response. I think effective coordination still does not exist within even UN agencies, and its preparedness and readiness to the 21st century challenges. And I just talked about conflict, but there is also another elements of development, I think, as well as gender empowerment, I think, another element. Because yes, there is a lot of good work done, but I think much better could have been done, because it's not the old school. And I think there is need for reform, which we all discussed, and the pace of reform is slow, and that needs to be expedited.
Thank you. I think you've laid out some really important themes. You've picked up on the role of the UN in coordinating and its importance in doing that, but you're helping us shift to what will be the next round of questions about what tools do we now need in face of 21st century challenges that maybe didn't exist or aren't in existence to solve the challenges that we face. So Ms. Kalinch, maybe we'll come to you on this, because the ambassador brought up the need for gender empowerment, and I sure think she'd agree. Also, youth empowerment has been a real focus of the UN in trying to understand and think about the role of the next generation in driving change. And so as a leading voice of a global network of young peace builders, what are some of the key recommendations and priorities that, that national, regional, and global governance structures should consider for facilitating meaningful participation of youth in conflict prevention and peace building processes? And before you answer, I keep forgetting to say this, please, if you have a question, put it into the Q&A box in the Zoom. It's not the raise your hand function, but the Q&A, and that way we'll see them and be able to respond. So Ms. Kalinch, sorry about that, but back to you.
Of course, thank you, Rachel. So I'm Gizem. I lead the United Network of Young Peace Builders, which is a global network of youth organizations active in the peacebuilding sector around the world. And before I move on to the recommendations, I'd like to highlight some of the priorities and the challenges that young people share around the world. First is our structural exclusion from political systems and decision-making processes, including the negotiation and implementation of peace agreements and processes such as the one that Ambassador Raz was describing earlier. We know that only 2% of the world's parliamentarians are under the age of 30, and many young people are not allowed to run for office, even when they do have the right to vote in 73% of the countries around the world. But this exclusion, it goes beyond political representation to an overall lack of accountability among member states towards young people and their concerns. In the last couple of years, we've seen young people taking to the streets to hold power holders accountable on issues ranging from racial justice, political freedom, sexual and reproductive rights, to climate change. Yet the newly adopted UN Security Council Resolution 2535 on youth, peace and security still speaks of weather events and natural disasters, instead of taking a bold stance and action which young people are desperately requesting to secure their futures. Thirdly, we've also seen an acceleration of shrinking civic space, whereby both state and non-state actors are introducing laws and practices that inhibit young people's civic engagement and violate their fundamental rights. Governments continue to use the youth label to position young people as a problem instead of part of a solution, whether this happens in the name of countering violent extremism or counterterrorism, or more recently in the responses that we've seen to the COVID-19 pandemic, where young people are again portrayed as the spoilers of quarantine and other measures. And what these developments have led to is young people's sense of disenfranchisement from formal procedures and a lack of trust in their political leaders, as well as multilateral systems. And it is really key for us to restore this trust by building intergenerational partnerships where young people are viewed as equal and essential partners for peace and sustainable development. And in terms of my recommendations, I think first and foremost, we really must facilitate an enabling environment where young people's civic spaces and their rights to freedom to dissent, peaceful assembly, freedom of expression and opinion, participation in public spheres is protected. Simply put, stop arresting, imprisoning, silencing, and killing my fellow young activists around the world. Second, there's also a danger that we create international agendas that lack national uptake. We really need member states to step up and create national strategies and tangible actions in partnership with young people, youth organizations, and other civil society actors in support of youth, peace, and security. And we also need regional intergovernmental bodies to provide, that have a really important role to provide policy guidance and to facilitate collaboration at the regional level in support of youth participation in peace building. And lastly, the global community must collectively invest in young people building peace through the creation of an independent youth, peace, and security fund, as called for by the independent progress study commissioned by the UN Secretary General. A fund that allocates $1 per young person, amounting to a total of $1.8 billion that is truly accessible to youth organizations, youth initiatives, and youth movements, which is unlike existing youth peace and security windows, such as the UN Peacebuilding Fund. In short, thank you.
Thank you so much. I think you're laying out the role of accountability or lack thereof is a theme we'll come back to, as well as really putting on the table the shrinking public space for dissent, which I think is a huge challenge that we're going to face moving forward. So thank you for that. Dr. Howard, I saved you for last in this first go round. As one of the leading academics studying the United Nations, I wanted you to help us take this and begin to put a frame around it. And my question for you, as we before we go into the next round, is to talk about the biggest misconceptions about what peace building is all about. I think we've got some things on the table, the importance of the convening power, legitimacy, expertise, the norms and principles, the coordinating function, the need for accountability, these things that the UN can provide and has provided kind of sets the stage. So if you can help us think about what are some of the biggest misconceptions about what it's all about? Where have you seen peacekeeping as a success? So we can hold that in our mind as we move forward in this conversation.
Thank you so much for the question, and thank you so much for this excellent panel and the ideas we're talking about now. Yeah, so I am an expert, especially in peacekeeping, and I will just say that I don't want it to derail us from Gizem's conversation, but as a professor, I also feel this obligation to step back for a moment and to look at the overarching studies and what they're showing, especially when it comes to peacekeeping. So we have this idea that peacekeeping is never really working, right? And that's all we read about in the news. But if you step back, and you probably won't, so I'm just going to summarize right now what the basic findings are in the literature. We have more than 36 studies published in our top articles and with top university presses, especially in the last 3 years, that demonstrate that peacekeeping is working. That when you have UN peacekeepers, you see a whole host of things that you don't see in other civil wars and in other post-conflict situations. Maybe with the exception of Colombia, I'm not so sure. So President Santos may beg to differ, but we'll see. So we have, I actually wrote down my list because I'm summarizing, many, many works right now. We have 15 studies that show fewer civilian deaths in post-conflict situations when peacekeepers are deployed, shorter civil wars, less recurrence of civil wars, less spread across borders. War tends to spread across borders, but when there are UN peacekeepers there, we have less spread. We see better post-war institutions in states where there are peacekeepers, especially in the security sector. We see a growth of civil society that we don't see in neighboring states where there are no peacekeepers. We see, very importantly, during conflict, less sexual and gender-based violence where UN peacekeepers are deployed. We have 2 recent studies that show very robust results statistically that where there are UN peacekeepers, we have less sexual and gender-based violence in the conflict. Now, for the question of how we get there, and this is the subject of my most recent book, and this goes to President Turk's point also about power and how thinking about how the UN exercises power. Peacekeepers are armed, but they don't exercise military force the way regular militaries do. And in many of our most recent successful missions, the concluded missions, thinking from East Timor to actually all the way back to Eastern Slavonia in Croatia, to the West African cases in Sierra Leone, Cote d'Ivoire, and Liberia, all of those cases, in all of those places where there were UN peacekeepers, we also had national militaries supporting the peacekeepers. I'll add East Timor in there also. So small forces that could backstop the UN peacekeepers. So we have this a pattern of a successful division of labor where peacekeepers were allowed to exercise the form of power that the UN exercises best, which is the power of persuasion, the ability to convene, the ability to mediate problems, to lead by example. So I will just say that no one wants peacekeepers deployed in their country. Very few people want outsiders to come in and meddle. And I just put in the chat this important statistic that we have very few wars between states, and we have a plateauing level of civil wars, but the type of conflict that's increasing is internationalized civil wars. States are meddling in each other's civil wars. That is the fastest rising form of armed conflict that we have in the world today. And that's what we need to be thinking about, how we prevent states from meddling in each other's civil wars. Thanks.
Well, thank you for that. I might move that to President Turk. I want to see if you would help us pick up on what Dr. Howard just said about how the UN should or can think about outside states meddling in the affairs of other states. And the way she presented it was as a negative, understandably, as outside states try to exert their power on collapsed states, the challenge that poses. But we know that the UN has also grappled with what is its responsibility to protect? When does it need to get involved in the challenges going on inside of states? So as we move into the 21st century, how do you think about this challenge of keeping states from meddling, but perhaps needing the UN to meddle, for want of a better word? How should we be thinking about this? Because this seems to be a real challenge that the United Nations will face moving forward.
Well, sure. First of all, this is an old question. This is not something that has emerged just now. I mean, the history of international relations for centuries has been very much around intervention or interference in affairs, violent affairs within countries. And the whole balance has been mixed. You could say that in some situations, non-interference was actually worse than interference. If you take, for example, the Spanish Civil War, 1936, 39, when some powers declared non-intervention as their policy. Others did not say anything but intervened, and both actually in their different ways made the situation worse. So I mean, this is a problem without a real definitive solution. The question of interference in other countries' civil war does not have a definitive solution because there is always a moral pressure to intervene. At the same time, the understanding that the international relations is not about morality, essentially. Therefore, who can intervene? A more powerful player can intervene in a civil war in a less powerful place. So there is no definitive answer to that. Now, I think partial answer and a potential for improved international cooperation exists, and the United Nations is not a bad place to start, because if powers get into serious discussion in the Security Council, they can improve the situations, and there has been a degree of success in the past years, of which Professor Howard also spoke. The question then is, how does UN move ahead? How does UN improve its performance? One has to understand that UN is not going to be able to produce miracles, but it can improve its performance. We have seen, for example, in the late 1990s, when there were huge disappointments with previous peacekeeping experiences in Bosnia and Rwanda in particular, which led to what was known then as Brahimi report, a report led by Lakhdar Brahimi, which was a platform for reform of the peacekeeping system in the United Nations, which then in turn helped in subsequent operations in West Africa in the first years of this century. So this is a kind of a search which goes on, and where learning is a possibility. So I think that the principles are first collective work, learning from immediate past experience, and adding new things as the situations change. Let me be more specific, perhaps. You see, in the roadmap for the future we want and the UN we need, I read that UN should establish a standing and reserve capacity to meet rapid deployable needs for civilian specific skills, especially for women civilian leaders. In other words, peacekeeping has become so complex that one has to really think about the whole range of it. And if one wants to use this kind of basic idea in a complex situation like in the Sahel, in Mali and the adjacent areas, one would badly need water specialists, people who are capable of addressing the questions of water use, water management, and be sufficiently well versed in diplomacy and sufficiently well acquainted with local history, with local economy, local politics. Now, is this peacekeeping? I would say yes, in a broader sense, and peacekeeping that addresses the problems as exist today. This is not the same type of peacekeeping that was necessary, let's say, in Liberia 20 years ago, or in Bosnia 25 years ago. This is not the same peacekeeping that was needed, let's say, on Sinai some 60 years ago. Peacekeeping is evolving, and reforms are possible if the current experience is sufficiently well understood and pushed as a way of learning. Now, the non-UN elements can help, and I am referring to the roadmap, and Professor Howard would certainly agree with me that all these dozens of studies that have been made clearly shed a lot of light on what the needs are and how to approach problems that we have today. And that's necessary. But then on the fundamental question, there is no such a thing as perfect intervention or perfect non-intervention. There is always a mixture of both, and in every situation you have to figure out the profile of international engagement, and that profile must be collective. Individual actions usually fail. collective actions have a certain degree of possibility to succeed.
Thank you. And let me remind those who are participating to put your questions into the Q&A box. It'll be easier for us to put it together. I'm going to come to both President Santos and Ambassador Raz with this focus on expertise that we've been hearing about from our panelists, and President Turk just helped moved us into this. President Santos, you raised it in your initial comments. What, in the Colombia context, you talked about how important it was the UN brought expertise. What are some tangible examples of what the UN brought in the context of your country? And are any of those important for other countries to know about?
Well, not only the UN, but the other countries that in a way helped the process, we asked them to share with us, especially the countries who had some experience on peace processes, how could they contribute to give us some light on how to proceed. As a matter of fact, what I did at the very beginning of the process was to bring in international advisors from countries that had experience, people who had hands-on experience. I brought in the former Minister of Foreign Relations of Israel, Shlomo Ben-Ami, who was one of the architects of the Camp David Agreement. I brought in Jonathan Powell, who was the Chief of Staff of the British Prime Minister, who was the Chief Negotiator of the Northern Ireland Agreement. I brought in the commander of the guerrillas in Salvador, who was the chief negotiator in that peace agreement. And they were always giving me advice on how to proceed on the many difficult opportunities that we had. Now, one aspect that I want to highlight, and this is, I think, applicable to Afghanistan also. One necessary condition for a peace process or an asymmetrical war, as it is called, to be resolved in a negotiating table, is the support of the neighbors of the region. This is without that support, and that we learned in Colombia by our many failures. We don't have that support. It's very difficult to have a successful peace agreement. That's why the first thing I did when I became president was to reestablish diplomatic and commercial relations with our neighbors, which we were in a very difficult position with Venezuela, with Ecuador, with Brazil, and that helped tremendously. And this is a very important aspect. Now, another specific case of how to build from other experiences the necessary elements for a successful peace process in the case of Colombia. Identifying the past spoilers, who were against the peace process or why, and to also bring in the sectors of society that were important to support the peace process. So we made a special effort. For example, a specific example, all my predecessors, the past 5-6 presidents, tried to make peace with FARC, and they failed. One of the elements that I identified was that they always isolated the military, and the military became spoilers. So what I did was exactly the contrary. I took the two most prestigious generals and put them as negotiators, as part of the negotiating team. And so I brought them in. That was absolutely crucial. And the young people, the students, since the very beginning, we made an effort to convince them that the peace process will give them a better future. And a very important anecdote, Ms. Killing, this is for you a good example. When I lost the referendum about the peace agreement, the young people that very night went to the streets in every city of Colombia to demand a new agreement, which was what the Constitution said. If you lose the referendum, you can renegotiate a new agreement and present it to Congress. And that's exactly what I did. But it was the pressure of the young people in the streets demanding a new agreement. And they went massively to all the plazas, to all the streets in all the cities of Colombia. So that type of interaction between the forces that make agreements possible, plus the elements that are necessary to facilitate the negotiations are always very important, and you have to take them into account in the very difficult process of making peace.
Could you spend one more minute on talking about how you created the channels of for empowerment of young people, so that when you needed them, in a sense, to come into the streets, when you wanted them to come into the streets, you had created relationships and channels that made that possible? Were there one or two examples of how the situation was such that this could happen?
Yes, we started to sell the peace process in the universities, to ask the students what they thought about it and what suggestions would they have during the negotiation. So in a way, they felt a bit like being part of it, of the negotiation, and they made that they in a way started to feel that they owned the process, and they started saying, listen, we, for example, the gender chapter, this is the only peace agreement which has a special gender chapter. That came from that process of giving the young people an opportunity to suggest, to discuss, to not participate directly in the negotiations, but to feed the negotiations with their ideas. And so a lot of discussions around the country started among students, among the young people. But the important thing was that they, in a way, felt that they were part of the process, and that's why they went, when the referendum was lost, to the streets. And I must say that was a very important aspect of saving the peace process.
Great, thank you. I can already tell that we're going to run out of time because there's so many questions and so many ways to pull everybody into this. So bear with me. Ambassador Raz, I'm coming to you next because you laid out some kind of tantalizing morsels for us to come back to that I think ties into this, when you said that the tools aren't sufficient right now. Not surprisingly, in some ways, every country and situation is different, but Afghanistan has a relationship with the United Nations, as you pointed out, for 2 decades, so we should be farther along. But in your context, what are the challenges that you are looking for the UN to help with? We've talked about the role of the neighbors. You began to raise the notion of terrorism that the UN maybe didn't have the best handle on. What are you thinking about in terms of the tools aren't sufficient in the context of Afghanistan? And then Ms. Kalink, we're coming to you to pick up on where President Santos left off.
Thank you, Rachel. I think if I add along the conversation what I've been hearing, and I think most of us are saying the same thing in a sense of the complexity and the nuances of today's world, conflict, peace talks, negotiations, something that we have to think out of the box, because this is what we're faced, this is where we are. And as I said, Afghanistan is not immune to that. And for us, the complex war we have, and I think it's even hard for me to name it civil war, because to me, when I look into it, the war before the 19 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that's when, for us, I think civil war started, because before that it was still the elements of the Cold War that had fueled the conflict in Afghanistan. And post collapse of the Soviet, I think that's when the civil war started, until when the Taliban came in. That's, I think, the emergence of what we are familiar with, the global terrorism. And I think that's where the beginning of the global terror was. And I think until now, I think the element of our conflicts is it's a combination of role of the neighbor, role of the region, the rise in global terrorism, as I said, because it's a new challenge, because what we have seen recently, if it's in Syria or Iraq and Afghanistan, it's this broader identity among terrorist groups to establish a unified governance or an emirate or an Islamic state. When that goes beyond Taliban fighting to take over Afghanistan, I think it's an alliance of probably it would be Afghanistan, and later on the next state, and the third and the fourth, and we see that's happening. So that's one element. And another, as I said, it's the region too, and weak governance structure as well, that was the result of such a long civil war and the Cold War. And I think these terrorist groups identifying those weaknesses and creating a space for them to rise. So when you come and to address those, and then you have UN is, and if I say it's definitely not prepared for that. I think with our regional cooperation in terms of economic cooperation, UN had been extremely supportive, engaged, working with us, and the two important multilateral platform that Afghanistan established in last 19 years is, one is the Heart of Asia Istanbul process, which is purely a reflection of our experience. And as President Santos said, that a stability in Afghanistan would definitely translate to stability in the region and the neighbors as well. And that's how we took that approach with our region, and saying our prosperity and growth will not be contained only to Afghanistan, but it will be spread vice versa. In conflict and instability will also be translated too. And so UN was a very strong supporter of our Heart of Asia Istanbul process, which was based on that thinking, and also RECA, which is the Regional Economic Cooperation Conference, and that's also an initiative led by Afghanistan with our immediate neighbors and beyond on the economic cooperation. But I think where UN could have played in a more stronger role, and it's not only, I think, in the situation of Afghanistan, taking political leadership. I think political leadership, I'm not meaning in a sense of undermining the Afghan government's ownership and leadership, but I think political decisiveness to engage with regional and relationship building. Because I think UN a lot of time defines the neutrality very strictly, which is important, I agree, but sometimes I think it's important to build upon the confidence measures that are not still built too strong between neighbors. And that is important. And also acknowledging and respective of sometimes those very delicate relationship between the neighbors that exist, and that was that hasn't been how do I say, addressed very, very well in last 19 years. So I'm going to go back to what I was saying earlier, and I think the honorable panelists are saying the same thing, and Professor Howard said the same. I think we can call it the international civil war, but I would say it's even more complex, even the civil war, because it's so hard to define. Our fight with Taliban is the civil war, or because they're not anymore in Afghanistan. Their leadership are staying outside of the Afghanistan with full freedom that they shouldn't have. And I also should say one last thing, that we should not think UN doesn't have the tool. The UN has the tool, and it needs to strengthen. I think the two important tools that are becoming really strong is the sanctioned regime. I think it's an important tool that the UN has, and it needs to be effectively used. And there are different elements we should incorporate. Yes, we have a sanctioned regime for terrorist groups. But there has to be something that I am constantly lobbying is for those who are involved in drug and narco business, because they are starting to fuel the conflict in many countries, and we're treating them as criminals, which is correct. But I think there has to be a thought beyond that, that they are creating instability in some countries.
Thank you so much. And I hope Christian Dorfel, who's with us today, recognized his question in my question to you. Ms. Killing, let's come back to you. You're watching what youth around the world are doing, and you heard that there is a role, a very important role that the public in general can play, and youth in particular. Are there examples that you think about when you're like, this is how it was done well? This is when we empowered youth for success. And I might tag on another issue that's different, but maybe it fits in this too, is we haven't talked about the role of social media and how that's changing the ability for everyone, but I would say particularly young people, to organize and get their ideas both globally engaged, but also directed to leaders who might not have otherwise listened to their views in the past. What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you for these questions. I would like to go back to Mr. Santos' remarks earlier about the important role that young Colombians have played in protecting the peace agreement when the agreement between the Colombian government and FARC was rejected by a small minority during the referendum. It is indeed true that young people took to the street, and they also used social media, hashtags, and online media to promote the importance of the peace agreement and thus protect it. So thank you for highlighting this important example of how young people are playing an important role in peace and security processes. At the same time, we also observe that more than 30 young Colombians have been assassinated in massacres across Colombia since the late summer, since August. And one of the first statements by the current president was to clarify that these events should be called collective homicides and not massacres. And our members, we have member organizations in Colombia that are reporting that these massacres are happening because the peace accord is not being implemented to its in a comprehensive way and truly addressing the structural issues that lead to violence. I would like to hear from Mr. Santos, how do you feel about these current developments, and how can we ensure that the civic space of young people in Colombia can be protected? And maybe to quickly go back to Rachel's question on the social media, well, it is, so there was a report on inclusive peace processes, youth inclusive peace processes that was commissioned by the UN Secretary General's Envoy on Youth called We Are Here. And it showed that traditionally we think of peace processes as the processes that happen within, around the table in the room, but that we can also see that the power to influence peace processes is not always in proximity to that table, that also a lot of important developments and issues can be pushed also outside and around that room. And social media being one of those. And that's why, linking it back to the issue of shrinking civic space, I would also really want to stress the importance of protecting young people's rights online. We see, especially during times of election or when there's a certain national interest at stake, the governments do tend to play certain, to repress the online spaces of young people, and so that they cannot voice their opinions and use those spaces to organize themselves. So that's the other side of the medallion when it comes to social media. In terms of initiatives where, that we can learn from, that are best practices, I would want to, let me see, there's a number of things that come to mind. I think it's, I would especially point to the initiatives led by young people. As I said, action from member states is lagging behind when it comes to youth, peace, and security, but the young people in those countries are not waiting for their leaders to take action. In Nigeria, young people have created a national coalition around youth, peace, and security, where they're trying to support the government in coming up with a national action plan on youth, peace, and security, and to collectively formulate their peaceful visions for the future for their nation. We see in Afghanistan, our member organizations have organized youth yurgas, so spaces where young people can also identify their key concerns that they would like to see reflected in these reinstalled intra-Afghanistan peace talks. And I would also be interested to hear from Ambassador Raz, how in this ongoing process are you tapping into the important resources that the young people provide in securing a lasting peace agreement? So I'm bouncing off my little contribution with two questions to Mr. Santos and Ambassador Raz.
Thank you. I know that we are going to run out of time, so I'm going to ask President Santos and Ambassador Raz to very quickly respond, because I want to get to a question from Volker Lehman directed towards Dr. Howard. So maybe quick responses to Ms. Kalink. President Santos.
Yes, first I agree with you that it's absurd for a government to try to change reality by simply changing the name of what is happening. And with that criticism, I share 100%. What can young people do with respect to the assassinations of the social leaders? They can do what they are best right now in doing, which is go out to the street and demand the implementation of the peace process, because part of the problem is precisely the how slowly this government is implementing the peace process. So demanding and pressing for the complete implementation of the peace process will be the best way that the young people can counteract what is happening right now.
Thank you so much. Ambassador Raz, quick intervention from you?
Sure. I think we strongly believe in the power of youth. So what you said, it's exactly what we know has defined the new image of Afghanistan. It's the power of our youth. In our peace process, we do have members of the negotiating team who are the younger generation. And I think it's such a powerful message, because our population, 70% is younger generation. So it's a very natural growth for them to come to the leadership role. That's one. In our parliament, we have one of the youngest parliaments, because a large number of our parliamentarians are the younger generation. And it's just that they won the election. The constituents supported them. And we also have consultations with them on a regular basis. We had 3 jirgas preparing for the peace talks. One was with the peace jirga, woman jirga, and then we had a youth jirga. So to bring the voice of a younger generation. And I think we're so blessed to have a president who strongly believes in the power of youth. So he very specifically focusing and empowering them. And another plus point is, as you said, in some countries it has turned to as a weakness, but for us it's a strength. We do have a free space for youth in the media and the social media to express their opinion. And I think I would also like to see a lot youth learning from platforms or mobilization and of work that you and your team is doing, because for us it's a new experience, but for you it had been a longer struggle, and you have learned from those who have started earlier. So I think greater organization among them will help us even further. But there is no doubt and there is no barrier for them. And we strongly believe the success of the peace agreement would be first with the younger generation, second with the women, because these are the 2 majorities, as the president says, that they're never counted as majorities.
Great, thank you. And President Turk, if you could take a look at that Q&A box, I think we'll finish this up after Dr. Howard with you taking one of those questions, and you'll help us segue. So thank you for that. And I hope that William Tarpe, who's with us, recognizes some of his questions around civil society in the answers that are being given. So Dr. Howard, there is a lot on the table. And there was a really good question from Volker that you were having a back and forth with in the chat. So let me kind of bring everyone into it. In another major anniversary year for the United Nations, where discussions are once again prevalent about the composition of rules of the road for the Security Council, especially in connection with the veto authority of the Council of Perm 5, what do you see as best ways to address kind of longstanding political log jams that prevent structural reform after over the next 5 to 10 years?
Thank you. It's a great question. And it feels my response feels incredibly dated, but I just feel like I have to say that the Security Council, with the structure of the 5 permanent veto members, that structure has been working for us for a long time, right? It's basically prevented war between the major powers for 75 years. And that is because they talk to each other on a regular basis. We have representatives of the US, Russia, and China talking to each other every day in the Security Council and through the Security Council. And that prevents conflict. So by diminishing the status of the UN Security Council, I cannot help but worry that we may be bringing more problems than we expect if we move the idea. So the basic idea of international law is that the Security Council holds the legitimacy to say whether the use of force abroad is legitimate, right? So it holds the authority to determine the international law on the use of force. And if we take away that cornerstone of international law, I don't know what we have anymore when it comes to armed conflict. If you look at that chart that I put up, we have very few conflicts between states, right? We have very few wars between states. And civil wars are decreasing, and it's becoming a little bit easier because of peacekeeping. It's not to say that it's great, but we have this new types of conflicts, the internationalized civil wars. I think increasingly, as automation becomes more profound in societies, we'll have more domestic level disputes as jobs dry up for our young people. And not just our young people. So this is not just a problem. The problem of employment is not just one across the developing world. It is going to be affecting the advanced industrialized countries in a major way in the future. And so our biggest challenges: pandemic disease, economic decline, a lack of jobs, climate change, armed conflict, especially the internationalized disputes, automation, and the rise of AI. And I know the Club de Madrid loves to talk about, this problem of the challenges of digital governance. None of these problems can be solved by single states alone, and yet the disruption and the uncertainty and the fear cause individuals and states to turn inward. And so people and states are less likely to cooperate with one another. And that's maybe where young people can come in to push their governments toward cooperation, to push toward justice, especially racial justice. And I think in general, the challenge now is to help citizens convince their state leaders that the only way we can make progress on any of these crucial issues is to work together collectively. And I will just say that, Rachel, you began the session by addressing this problem of rejection of multilateralism and a rise of nationalism. And I just want to end my portion because I want to hear, especially from President Turk and the others, collective security is in the national interest. It is the only way we are going to solve the major threats to every individual on the planet, is through collective responses.
Great, thank you. I see the questions in the chat, and Ambassador Raz, the next one's coming to you after this one to President Turk. I asked you to look at some of the Q&As, and if you want to answer one of those, that's fine. We do have a question though that's that I think Dr. Howard set up well for us, and it picks up on your last answer. In your last answer, you were talking about how this balance between intervention and interference has always been with us and has always been a struggle. And I wonder, when you look out now, in some ways, all problems are old ones. We've seen many things before in one way or another. What do you see as the new challenges coming? What's coming that is going to be particularly difficult? Is there anything new in the change in digital, social media? Is there anything particularly new in terms of automation that's coming? When you look out, what do you see as the trends that are challenging that the UN needs to start retooling for now, because it's going to be tough to catch up with? And I think you're on mute.
Well, I think that I can simply build on what Professor Howard was explaining to us. I mean, first of all, the UN system has been about prevention of war between major powers. It has also introduced, through the permanent members of the Security Council, a sense of balance of power, which I think is a very important quality of the United Nations and has helped in the past. I think that for future discussion, it's important to understand that it is not veto that makes permanent members special. It's the permanence which makes them special, because they're always there. They are there with all problems, and they developed a habit of, dealing with every problem under the sun. So that's there, and that's an important quality. I myself, I was involved as diplomat from 1992 onwards in the discussion on the reform of the Security Council, which went nowhere for reasons which we can discuss in a separate conversation at some later stage. And I think that, the Council has worked moderately well, in fact, with the understanding of the difficulties which go with the growing number of internal armed conflicts and this perennial question of intervention and non-intervention. So that's one thing. I mean, United Nations is not only about the Security Council. When you ask the question about the priority problems or threats to the future, obviously, here in the Club de Madrid, where I and other former presidents discuss things, we have come to a sense of principles of global equity that should be guiding in dealing with crisis. That's one way of approaching it. The other way, which I think is really even more important, is this: the question of ripeness. When is a particular problem ripe for addressing? And if one looks from that point of view at the global list of challenges for the future, one would say, obviously, infectious diseases, which have always been explained as one of the possible threats to security, are now at a stage when, something needs to be done. There was this immediate nationalistic response to COVID-19, clearly everywhere, including within the European Union. Interesting, the European Union continues to be criticized for not being sufficiently collective at the first phase. Now, then the European Union had to remind member states that obviously the authority, the jurisdiction, if I may put it that way, on health issues is still within nation states. Very little in this is collective. And now, at the time of the WHO discussions on evaluation of experience with COVID-19, we are going to get an analysis of how the international system works, what it doesn't do well enough, and where the future should be. And that, I think, is a question which is becoming ripe and on which we should focus. So infectious disease is clearly there. Secondly, global warming. Again, this is there for a long time, and we shouldn't talk about climate change too generally. Global warming is a problem, and there is an understanding, there is a degree of mobilization of civil society. And I'm sure that more pressure needs to be exerted if one wants to make something serious. Now, again, one should not expect that to happen in the Security Council, really not. One should not expect that leadership will always come from the United States, because unfortunately, right now, it's not coming from the United States. But the United States is not alone. So European Union could lead more energetically. China should also explain what actually it will do towards a carbon neutral economy in China. That would be leadership and commitment to multilateralism one would expect from China at this point. So there are others who can do many things. And therefore, my clear priorities are these two. Now, coming close with the Security Council related and UN traditions related questions. I think new weapons is something that have to be addressed much more energetically. The UN for the 75 years has proven to be a useful instrument of norm creation of international regimes, and that worked to some extent. It is much better that we had UN than we were if UN did not exist. So that clearly is a very important experience. However, today we see technological developments in new weapons, including weaponization in the outer space, which should worry us. And there should be a pressure to do something. And here, again, Security Council is not going to act immediately, but must be a part of this discussion, and pressure has to be placed on it. Now, these are three priorities I suggested. Infectious diseases, ripe now. Global warming, sufficiently strong threat, so everybody should be afraid, and fear is a very good motivator for action. And third, new weapons as something that the Security Council should be worried about, and everybody else in the United Nations should be worried about. I know that my list of priorities is not something that everybody will share, but you asked me what my opinion is, and here is what it is.
Thank you so much. And those priorities are actually the ones that my organization focuses on, which is technological innovations that could bring enormous positive benefits, but will also bring huge new risks, political risks and ethical risks, climate change, and we also focus on nuclear risk, of course. And there's a lot of innovations happening there, and that are quite scary. I wanted to flip now. We're running out of time. We have about 6 minutes left before we have to close. And Ambassador Roz, there's a good question from Connor Seeley that I wanted to direct for the Q&A. And I'll just read it out for the group and give you a chance to think about it. Following up on the point on regional cooperation that you had just mentioned, can you talk more about the specific value add of the UN and UN approaches? Goes on to talk about the role of the Istanbul process and you saw the details in that. But let's talk about specifics of value adds of the UN and UN approaches.
Thank you, Rachel. I think my first response in terms of the value added and UN's role would be, UN is a trusted partner. It's a partner that in platforms as in multilateral platforms as part of regional cooperation, it's a party that every member states trust them, and I think that's where they could help in the facilitation. UN had been an effective partner in terms of our cooperation with Central Asia. There is a more of an active and engaged role that UN has, as well as the EU, because the EU also have one really important platform in Central Asian countries, where Afghanistan is also a special member. So that I can say, and I think the second is also because UN, even I think it somehow does relate to its Security Council structure, because either we agree or not, they carry a weight, and they carry a weight, and some of very important political conversation that we do have with our neighbors, and the ones I made a reference earlier, that it helps, that it needs more confidence building measures. And I think UN can take more of a proactive role in trying to facilitate that, because it's very obvious sometimes we arrive at the place where we have very limited room for conversation, and I think UN can play a role just because they do carry that important structure of the Security Council to facilitate. So I'm going to stop here very briefly, but Afghanistan is a country that strongly believes in multilateralism, in the odds of where we're talking about the rise of nationalism, the doubt on democracy, the doubt on the importance of collective approach and cooperation. We are in this odds of strongly believing in the opposite of all. We believe in democracy, we believe in the power of youth and women, we believe in multilateralism and international cooperation. So I think it's a good time, because for us, we went through an era where we didn't believe in any of them, when we lived in total isolation. And I think we offer an important enthusiasm and commitment, which comes from the top leadership, and here we are on the same page with our partners and all of those who believe in the same values. So that's a great opportunity, and we are willing to expand it further.
Great, thank you. Gizem, there's a question in the chat from Veselin Popovsky that's directed to you. How do you evaluate the suggestion to upgrade the Peacebuilding Commission into the Peacebuilding Council?
I thank you for this question. I'm not sure if I have kind of the technical understanding of these UN structures to adequately answer this question, because I wasn't aware of this development. But what I do think is important is, or to realize, is that the UN Security Council, and we see this with the Youth, Peace and Security Agenda as well, it does offer a platform to a limited amount of member states due to the way it's set up, with permanent and non-permanent member states. And yeah, that makes it also quite difficult for really important, it's the highest political authority when it comes to peace and security, but some of the documents and the important policy guidance that it provides, yet in order for that to, for governments around the world, but also other actors, important actors such as international organizations, donor community, private sector, to really fully feel ownership over, for instance, the Youth, Peace and Security resolutions, we also must look at how can we engage with governments beyond the Security Council. I'm not sure if what the person asking the question, this development that is being pointed at, if that is one way of broadening engagement when it comes to peace and security beyond the Security Council, but that is one of the issues that we see. And another issue that we see is that within New York, there is quite an awareness and some political support for youth, peace and security, but that doesn't necessarily translate to the UN's presence when it comes to peacekeeping missions, but also political missions in third countries or other countries. A lot of our member organizations, they manage to access the UN in New York or in Geneva, but to try to make those same connections and to support UN processes or peace talks supported by the UN in their own country, that's a lot more difficult. And there we also see that it is not only key to build young people's understanding of peace and security, but also that we must support UN entities in places where there is ongoing peace process, in understanding the full scope of the Youth, Peace and Security agenda and how they can really bring it to life in ongoing peace processes, in short. Thank you.
Thank you. President Santos, the organizers have given me 2 more minutes, and so I'm going to devote the last question to you. President Turk laid out for us this notion of ripeness, and then some issues, infectious disease, global warming, and new weapons that were ripe for attention because they're on people's minds. When you think about the issues that are coming and will challenge peacemaking and peace building and the UN more broadly, what are some of the issues that you see coming that that may be ripe for us to turn our attention to. And you're on mute.
The obvious priorities have been mentioned. For me, the most important challenge is climate change. Nuclear proliferation is still a very important priority for the UN. But beyond that, and looking towards the future from the perspective of a country like mine or this region, there are other issues. The implementation of the SDGs. I think we have an agenda. Everybody has agreed to it, and we must make an effort to try to implement the SDGs the best way possible. And there's a specific point that for me has been a frustration, and that the UN has not been able to cope with it. More than 50 years ago, the UN declared the war against drugs, drug trafficking. And it's a war that has not been won. And a war that has not been won in 50 years has been lost. But there is a resistance to change the attitude, the perspective of how to deal with this problem. And I think this is a challenge that we have. And if we are able to change our paradigm, we will be much more effective in this war that is still going on, and it's increasing in many areas of the world. I rest my case. Thank you.
Thank you. This has been such a fascinating discussion with so much expertise on the panel, with such wide-ranging experiences and views. I wish we could do individual conversations and we could spend the whole day doing it, but thank you to our panelists for staying with us and helping weave together some of the challenges that the UN will face. And I think importantly though, also beginning to remind ourselves of what the UN has done and the roles of convening legitimacy, expertise, the patience that we need. These are very tough problems. And the notion that we're asking the UN to tackle some of the globe's most difficult challenges. So not surprising, it's hard and slow. And I thank you to our panelists for helping us see that, continuing to stay motivated to think about it, and also for thinking about the next generation that's coming, the challenges they're going to face, and how to make sure that we engage them in the solutions so that they'll be sustainable for years to come. So thank you all, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you.